I write this, knowing the words themselves are a confession, that each syllable is evidence of my cowardice, that if anyone finds this record they will burn it along with whatever remains they find of me. But I need to set down what happened, need to speak into the void even if only the void listens, because the silence of keeping it locked inside has become heavier than any punishment the Imperium could devise. My name was Corporal Davin Crow, 4th Platoon, 2nd Company, Caskin's 17th Infantry Regiment, and I am a deserter. The word sits in my mouth like a stone, heavy and cold, and I taste it every moment of every day since I ran. They will find me eventually. They always do. The Imperium's memory is longer than any human life, its reach extending through generations, and I know that somewhere in the vast bureaucratic machinery of the Administratum, my name appears on a list with a mark beside it that means death. It began on a world whose name I never learned, just another designation in the endless war, another planet marked for compliance or extinction depending on the Emperor's inscrutable will. We had been fighting there for 63 days when I decided I could not continue. 63 days of watching men dissolve into their component parts under Xenos weaponry I could not comprehend. 63 days of sleeping in mud that stank of chemicals and decay. 63 days of eating ration paste that tasted like recycled cardboard soaked in machine oil. 63 days of praying to an emperor who seemed very far away, while death squatted beside us in the trenches and picked its teeth with our bones. The other men in my unit had stopped talking by day 40. We communicated in grunts and hand signals, our vocabularies reduced to the essential language of survival, enemy, ammunition, cover, corpse. Even prayer became mechanical, the words of the Imperial Creed spilling from our lips like water from a leaking pipe, constant and meaningless and unstoppable. The night I ran, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, purple-black and swollen with the chemical residue of orbital bombardment. Our position had been overrun twice that day, retaken once, and we crouched now in the ruins of what had been retaken, surrounded by the bodies of men who had worn the same uniform, served the same emperor, died for the same invisible cause. Commissar Dren walked the line that evening, his black greatcoat somehow pristine despite the filth we all wore like a second skin. He stopped before each man, looked into each face, and I saw him evaluating, calculating, determining who had enough left to continue fighting and who had reached the end of their usefulness. When he reached me, his eyes were grey and cold as ship metal, and he stared at me for what felt like an hour, though it could only have been seconds. Then he moved on, and I knew I had been judged and found wanting, knew that the next time I hesitated or failed or showed fear, his bolt pistol would solve the problem of my continued existence. That knowledge settled into my bones like radiation poisoning, invisible but lethal, and I felt something break inside me that had been bending for weeks. It was not courage that broke I had lost that long ago. It was the last thread of whatever made me believe that obedience mattered, that duty meant something, that my death in service to the Imperium would have any significance at all beyond one less body to feed and transport. I looked at the men around me and saw corpses that had not yet stopped moving, saw myself among them, and the certainty of my death shifted from abstract to immediate. I would die here, tonight, tomorrow, next week. The timing did not matter. I would die here and be buried in an unmarked grave on a world whose name I did not know, and the Imperium would replace me with another warm body pulled from another hive city or agri-world or prison planet, and that body would die too, and on forever in the name of the God Emperor of mankind. So I ran. I waited until the watch changed, until the confusion of men moving in darkness gave me cover, and I slipped away from the trench line like smoke dissipating in wind. My heart hammered against my ribs hard enough to crack them, and every sound, every scrape of boot on stone, every rattle of equipment seemed loud enough to wake the dead. I expected the crack of a bolt pistol, expected Commissar Dren's voice calling me back or calling for my execution, expected searchlights to pin me against the darkness like an insect on a specimen board, but none came. I reached the edge of our defensive perimeter, scrambled down into a bomb crater filled with water that stank of sulfur and things I did not want to identify, and kept moving. Behind me, the sounds of the camp faded slowly, replaced by the ambient noise of a dying world. Wind howling through shattered buildings, distant artillery like the grinding of massive teeth, the occasional scream of something that might have been human. I walked for hours through terrain that had been transformed by war into something alien and hostile. Buildings that had once housed civilians were now just abstract sculptures of twisted metal and broken concrete, their purposes erased by violence. I passed through what had been a market square, the stalls crushed flat, and the goods they had sold, fabrics, food, tools, lives, now just stains on the pavement. Bodies lay everywhere, not fresh enough to be from the current fighting but not old enough to have reduced to bone, caught in that terrible middle stage where decay is most visible and most horrifying. I tried not to look at them but could not help myself, and in the darkness they seemed to move, seemed to turn their ruined faces toward me in silent accusation. "You left your brothers," they seemed to say. "You abandoned your post. You broke your oath. Traitor, coward, deserter." I found shelter as dawn approached, crawling into the basement of a collapsed administratum building where filing cabinets lay scattered like the bones of some bureaucratic beast. The papers that had once filled them were everywhere. Thousands of documents recording the mundane details of imperial governance, tax assessments, work quotas, birth registries, death certificates, all rendered meaningless by the war that had reduced this world to rubble. I sat among them and tried to convince myself that I had made the right choice, that survival was not cowardice, that the Imperium asked too much of its citizens, and that walking away was not betrayal but sanity. But the words rang hollow in my head, and I knew they were lies. I had sworn an oath when I took the uniform, had pledged my life to the Emperor's service, and I had broken that oath. The fact that the oath might be meaningless, that the Emperor might not even know I existed, that my death would change nothing, none of that mattered. I had given my word, and I had run, and that made me less than human in the eyes of the Imperium. I slept eventually, exhaustion overcoming fear, and woke to the sound of engines. For a moment I thought they had found me already, thought the commissariat had tracked me somehow, and was coming to dispense justice. But the engines were heavy, industrial, moving slowly through the ruins, with the patient grinding of harvesting machinery. I crept to a gap in the rubble and looked out carefully, and what I saw made my stomach clench with a fear different from anything I had felt in the trenches. Servitors, dozens of them, moving through the ruins in formation, their augmented bodies clicking and whirring as they worked. They were collecting bodies, I realized, loading both the dead and the dying onto massive cargo haulers with the same mechanical efficiency they would use to load ammunition or supplies, and overseeing the work, draped in red robes marked with the gear and skull symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus, stood a tech priest whose face was more machine than flesh, whose eyes glowed with a sickly green light that seemed to cut through shadows like searchlights. I pressed myself against the rubble and tried to make myself invisible, tried to slow my breathing and quiet my heartbeat, as if the machines could hear it. The servitors worked without pause or rest, their movements precise and tireless, and I watched as they loaded bodies onto the haulers, regardless of whether those bodies still moved or made sounds. Some of the wounded cried out, begged for help or mercy, and the servitors ignored them completely, their programming not including any parameters for compassion or consideration. The tech priest observed everything with the detachment of someone reviewing data, occasionally making notations on a data slate clutched in mechadendrites that emerged from beneath the robes like steel tentacles. When the haulers were full, they moved off in a convoy toward what looked like a processing facility in the distance, and new haulers took their place, ready to be filled. I stayed hidden until they moved on, until the sound of their engines faded into the constant background noise of the ruined world. And then I stayed hidden longer, too afraid to move, too afraid that stepping out of the shadows would somehow alert them to my presence. When I finally emerged, the sun was high overhead, filtering through the chemical haze to cast everything in a sickly yellow-green light that made the ruins look even more alien than they had in darkness. I was hungry, had not eaten since before I ran, and thirst was beginning to make my throat feel like sandpaper and my thoughts sluggish. I searched through the rubble looking for anything useful: food, water, weapons, supplies, but found nothing except more papers, more evidence of lives that had been lived here before the Imperium came, with its war and its weapons, and its absolute certainty that compliance was the only acceptable outcome. The days that followed, blurred together into a grey sameness, marked only by the rhythm of basic survival. I moved mostly at night, sleeping in whatever shelter I could find during the day, always listening for the sound of engines or voices or anything that might indicate I was not alone. I scavenged water from broken pipes, collected it in scraps of metal, and let the sediment settle before drinking, knowing it was probably contaminated, but having no choice. Food was harder. I found some ration packets in the wreckage of what had been a supply depot, but they were old, and the preservation seals had failed, and the contents made me sick when I tried to eat them. I resorted to eating things I found growing in the ruins: fungus and strange plants that sprouted from the chemical-saturated soil, and prayed to an emperor. I was not sure listened that they would not kill me, but it was not starvation or thirst or contaminated food that became my greatest enemy. It was the silence. In the trenches, there had been constant noise: weapons, fire, explosions, men shouting orders or screaming in pain, the vox crackling with communications. Even at night, even during the brief periods of relative quiet, there had been the presence of other men, the knowledge that I was part of something larger than myself, that my suffering was shared. Now, alone in the ruins, that constant noise was replaced by an absence that felt physical, that pressed against my eardrums like depth pressure. I began to hear things that were not there: voices calling my name, footsteps behind me when I walked, the familiar sounds of camp life that turned out to be just wind moving through broken structures. I talked to myself to fill the silence, held conversations with imaginary companions, recited prayers and regulations, and anything else I could remember just to prove that I still had a voice. On the 8th day after I deserted, I found the other survivors. They were hiding in what had been a cathedral, its walls still standing despite the bombardment, its interior gutted but structurally sound. I stumbled into their camp by accident, too focused on finding shelter before dawn to notice the signs of habitation, and found myself surrounded by weapons before I could react. There were 7 of them, all wearing the tattered remains of Imperial Guard uniforms from different regiments, all wearing the same haunted look I saw when I caught my reflection in standing water. They held me at gunpoint while their leader, a woman whose left arm ended in a crude prosthetic made from scavenged metal, demanded to know who I was, what unit I had belonged to, whether I was a spy or an agent provocateur sent by the Commissariat to root out deserters. I told them the truth because lying seemed pointless, because the desperation in their eyes told me they would know if I lied, because I was so desperate for human contact that I would have confessed to anything just to not be alone anymore. I told them I had run from my unit 8 days ago, told them about Commissar Dren and his cold evaluation, told them about the certainty of death and the breaking of whatever internal structure had kept me fighting. When I finished, the woman lowered her weapon slowly, and I saw recognition in her face, saw that she understood because she had made the same calculation, had reached the same conclusion, had run for the same reasons. Her name was Sergeant Mana Volk, formerly of the Talan 8th, and she had been hiding in the ruins for 4 months. The others had been there various lengths of time, the longest being almost a year, and together they had created something that resembled a community in the shadow of the Imperium's war. They shared supplies, took turns keeping watch, told stories about their lives before the war to remind themselves they had been people once, not just soldiers. They took me in because they understood that every deserter was a brother or sister in cowardice, that we were bound together by our shared shame and our shared fate. Because we all knew, though no one said it aloud, that we were living on borrowed time, that the Imperium would find us eventually, and when it did there would be no trial, no appeal, no mercy. Living among them was like existing in a strange dream where normal rules were suspended, but never truly absent. We pretended we were building something sustainable, pretended we could survive indefinitely in the ruins, pretended the war would eventually move on and leave us alone. But the pretense was paper thin, and underneath it we all felt the weight of what we had done, the enormity of breaking the most fundamental law of the Imperium, that a citizen's life belongs not to themselves, but to the Emperor, and to refuse that ownership is to commit the gravest possible crime. We never discussed what would happen when they found us, but I saw it in everyone's eyes during the quiet moments, saw them calculating how they would die, whether they would resist or accept their execution, whether dying as a coward was really worse than dying as a soldier. The routine they had established was simple and focused entirely on staying hidden and staying alive. We slept during the day in shifts, always with someone watching the approaches to our shelter. At night, we scavenged for supplies, moving through the ruins like ghosts, taking anything useful and leaving no traces of our presence. We avoided the servitor teams that came through periodically to collect bodies and salvage, learned their patterns and schedules, made ourselves invisible to their sensors. We rationed everything carefully, food, water, ammunition, even conversation, as if our words might somehow be detected and used against us. And every few days, someone would disappear on a scouting run and return with news of the war's progress, reporting on troop movements and fighting positions with the bitter irony of soldiers observing a conflict they were no longer part of. I learned their stories during the long days of hiding and waiting. Volk had deserted after watching her entire squad die in a minefield, after dragging herself through the bodies of men she had trained with and commanded and loved as brothers, after realizing that her death would serve no purpose except to add one more corpse to the pile. Trooper Venn had run after 57 consecutive days of combat, left him unable to distinguish reality from hallucination, after he started seeing things that were not there and hearing orders from officers who were dead. Specialist Karth had been sentenced to death by his commissar for some minor infraction, falling asleep on watch, hesitating before an assault, something trivial made capital by the Imperium's absolute standards, and had escaped execution by killing the commissar and running into the ruins before anyone could stop him. Each story was different, but they all shared the same core. A moment when continued service became impossible, when the choice narrowed to death or flight, when we chose to live, even though living meant becoming something the Imperium considered worse than dead. But the illusion of safety could not last forever. The war was a living thing that moved and grew and consumed everything in its path, and eventually its attention turned toward our hiding place. We heard the bombardment first, the deep thunder of artillery that made the ground shake and dust fall from the cathedral's damaged ceiling. Then the sounds of fighting grew closer, small arms fire and explosions, and the distinctive shriek of Xenos weaponry, until we could no longer pretend the battle was somewhere else. Volk called us together, and we debated what to do with the desperate urgency of people who knew all their options were bad. We could stay and hope the fighting passed us by, but if troops entered the cathedral, we would be discovered and executed. We could run deeper into the ruins, but the combat had surrounded our position, and we might walk directly into the battle. Or we could try to slip away during the confusion, use the chaos of war as cover, and find somewhere new to hide. We chose to run. It seemed like the least terrible option, and at that point we had become experts at choosing between terrible options. We gathered what supplies we could carry, abandoned everything else, and slipped out of the cathedral as night fell and the fighting reached its peak intensity. The ruins had been transformed into an active battlefield, and moving through them was like navigating a maze where every turn might lead to sudden death. We saw the flash of weapons fire reflected off broken walls, heard screams and prayers and orders shouted in a dozen different languages, smelled the familiar stench of burning promethium and scorched flesh. We moved in single file with Volk leading and Karth bringing up the rear, everyone moving as silently as generations of hiding had taught us, everyone knowing that a single mistake would mean discovery and execution. We almost made it. We were perhaps 2 kilometers from the cathedral, moving through what had been a residential district, when the patrol found us. They appeared from behind the shell of a building with the sudden inevitability of fate. 20 guardsmen in clean uniforms with fresh ammunition and eyes that had not yet learned to recognize the walking dead when they saw them. Their lieutenant called for us to halt, identify ourselves, explain what we were doing in a combat zone without weapons or orders. And in that moment, facing the Imperium we had fled, we each made our choice. Ven raised his hands immediately, dropped to his knees, began to beg for mercy, though he knew there would be none. Karth pulled a concealed pistol and fired twice before a lasgun volley cut him down, his body jerking as the beams burned through flesh and bone. 3 others ran, scattered in different directions, and I heard the crack of weapons and knew they would not get far. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything except stare at the lieutenant, while my mind tried to process what was happening. Volk stood beside me, her metal hand hanging at her side, her face set in an expression of weary acceptance. The lieutenant walked toward us slowly, studying our faces and our ragged uniforms, and I saw the moment he understood what we were. His expression shifted from confusion to disgust, and he spat at our feet before calling for his sergeant to bring restraints. We were bound with plasteel cuffs that bit into our wrists, forced to kneel in the dirt, while the patrol searched us for weapons or contraband. They found nothing. We had been carrying only what we needed to survive, but their contempt was palpable, their hatred radiating from them like heat from a fire. To them we were not just criminals, but something fundamentally broken, something that violated the natural order of the Imperium, something that needed to be destroyed before it could contaminate anyone else. They marched us back toward their base camp with rifles pressed against our spines and hands, ready to strike if we stumbled or slowed. The walk took several hours, and during that time I had nothing to do except think about what came next. Execution was certain. There was no other punishment for desertion, no possibility of clemency or reduced sentence. The only question was whether it would be quick or whether they would make an example of us, whether the commissar who judged us would be efficient or theatrical. I tried to pray, tried to ask the Emperor for forgiveness or mercy or anything at all, but the prayers stuck in my throat like stones, and I could not force them out. What was the point of praying to a god who demanded absolute obedience when I had chosen disobedience? What was the point of asking forgiveness when I was not sure I regretted what I had done? The base camp appeared as dawn broke, a vast temporary city of prefabricated structures and razor wire spreading across what had been a commercial district. Thousands of soldiers moved through it with the purposeful efficiency of the Imperial Guard machine, and the sound of their activity: marching feet, vehicle engines, equipment being loaded and unloaded was almost comforting in its familiarity. We were taken to a holding area near the camp's center, thrown into a cage made of chain-link fencing and guarded by men who looked at us like we were diseased animals. Other deserters were already there, perhaps 30 of them, all wearing the same expression of hopeless resignation. No one spoke. What was there to say? We had all made the same choice, had all reached the same destination, and now we would all share the same fate. They came for us in groups of 5, called names from a list, and led the chosen out of the cage toward a building whose purpose became clear when we heard the shots. Single executions, efficient and quick, the Imperium disposing of its broken parts with the same casual thoroughness it used for everything else. I watched the numbers dwindle, watched men and women walk toward their deaths with varying degrees of courage or despair, and waited for my name. When it finally came, Corporal Crow, Kaskan 17th, I stood on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and walked toward the guards, with a strange sense of calm settling over me. This was the end I had earned, the price I had known I would pay when I ran. At least it would be quick. At least it would be over. But they did not take me to the execution building. Instead, the guards marched me across the camp to a different structure, one marked with the gear and skull symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and I felt the calm evaporate instantly as understanding crashed over me like a wave. They were not going to execute me. They were going to do something worse. The building's interior was cold and sterile, lit by harsh white lights that made everything look bleached and unreal. Tech priests moved through it with clicking mechadendrite limbs, their enhanced eyes glowing in the dimness, their movements precise and inhuman. Servitors stood along the walls in neat rows, their bodies modified past the point of humanity, their faces slack and empty of anything that might have once been called consciousness. And in the center of the room, connected to dozens of cables and tubes and wires, stood something that had been human once, but was human no longer. A tech priest approached me, taller than any natural human had a right to be, its robes concealing a body that seemed more machine than flesh. Its voice, when it spoke, was synthesized, emotionless, stating facts with the flat delivery of a recorded message. I was to be processed, it said. My crime of desertion had made me forfeit my humanity, and therefore my body would be repurposed to serve the Imperium in a more useful capacity. I would become a servitor, my higher brain functions wiped away, my body augmented with mechanical systems, my remaining consciousness reduced to whatever was needed to carry out basic tasks. I would serve forever, it said, my punishment lasting as long as my biological components could be maintained. Decades or centuries of mindless labor in payment for my brief moment of cowardice. I tried to scream, tried to beg, tried to do anything except accept this fate. But the guards held me fast, while the tech priest's mechadendrites reached toward me with terrible gentleness. I felt needles pierce my skin, felt chemicals flood my system, felt my thoughts beginning to slow and fragment as the drugs took effect. The last thing I remember clearly is the tech priest's glowing eyes studying me, with the detachment of an artisan examining raw materials, calculating how best to reshape me into something useful. Then the world began to fade, colors draining away, sounds becoming distant and muffled, sensation reducing to abstract signals that meant nothing. But I did not disappear completely. That was the horror they never tell you about servitors, the secret the Mechanicus keeps, because revealing it would be too cruel even for the Imperium. Some part of me remained conscious, trapped behind the chemical and mechanical modifications, unable to control my body or speak or do anything except observe. I became a passenger in my own flesh, watching through eyes I could not close as my body was opened and rebuilt, as flesh was removed and replaced with synthetic components, as my spine was interfaced with cogitation systems, and my arms became tools for whatever task I was being designed to perform. The tech priests worked with mechanical precision, discussing my modifications in binary cant, while my silent screams echoed in the prison of my skull. When the process was complete, I have no idea how long it took, hours or days or weeks, measured in the currency of endless agony. I was connected to a control system and given my first command. My body obeyed instantly, moving with smooth efficiency to perform whatever task had been programmed into my modified nervous system. I had no choice, no ability to resist, no way to stop my hands from working or my legs from walking when ordered. I had become exactly what the Imperium intended, a tool that could follow orders without question, complaint, or conscience. And somewhere deep inside, in whatever small corner of my mind they had not been able to erase completely, I remained aware, trapped forever in a body I could not control, serving the Imperium I had tried to flee. They assigned me to a manufactorum on the world where I had first deserted, put me to work assembling components for weapons that would arm soldiers who might one day face the same choices I had faced. My days became identical, one flowing into another without distinction or variation. I stood at a workstation for 20 hours at a time, my augmented hands performing the same motions over and over, assembling pieces into wholes that would be shipped elsewhere to kill people I would never meet. The other servitors working alongside me were silent, their faces slack and empty, and I wondered how many of them contained some fragment of consciousness like mine, how many trapped minds were screaming behind blank eyes, how many deserters and heretics and criminals had been repurposed into these hollow tools. The overseer was a tech priest who walked the factory floor constantly, monitoring productivity and making adjustments to servitors who fell below acceptable performance metrics. Sometimes, Those adjustments were mechanical, replacing worn components, updating programming, optimizing neural interfaces. Sometimes they were chemical, injecting compounds that suppressed whatever remained of our original personalities and left us even more hollow than before. I lived in terror of those adjustments, feared that each one might be the last, that the next injection might erase the final fragment of self that remained and leave me truly gone. But the terror itself was proof that I still existed, that some part of Dav Ven Crow survived inside the servitor-designated Unit 7743, and I clung to that knowledge like a drowning man clings to wreckage. Months passed, or maybe years. I had no way to mark time except by the gradual decay of my biological components. My organic flesh began to fail, breaking down under the strain of constant labor, and the tech priests replaced it piece by piece with synthetic substitutes. My left leg first, removed below the knee, and replaced with a piston-driven prosthetic that never tired. Then my right hand, the fingers worn down to bone by repetitive motion, swapped for a multi-tool appendage better suited to my assigned tasks. Then parts of my torso, organs that had become diseased or damaged, replaced with mechanical systems that performed the same functions with greater efficiency. Each replacement made me less human, pushed me further from whatever I had been and closer to pure machine, and I felt the distance growing between what I remembered and what I had become. But the memories themselves began to fade, smoothed away by time and chemical suppression and the sheer overwhelming monotony of servitor existence. I struggled to remember my name, to remember the faces of the men I had served with, to remember the specific moment when I had chosen to run. The details blurred and merged, became abstract rather than concrete, until I was not sure anymore which memories were real and which were fragments of dreams or hallucinations generated by a degenerating brain. I remembered the cathedral where we had hidden, but could not remember how long I had stayed there or who else had been present. I remembered being captured, but the faces of the guards had become generic, interchangeable, and I could not separate that memory from others like it. I remembered pain, remembered fear, remembered the sensation of screaming without sound, but even those became distant, academic, like reading about someone else's suffering in a report. The worst part was not the loss of memory or identity or even humanity. The worst part was the creeping suspicion that this fate was not unique to me, that every servitor in the Imperium might contain the same trapped consciousness, that behind every slack face and empty eye there might be someone screaming. How many millions of us were there? How many billions across the Imperium's million worlds? How many deserters and criminals and heretics and unfortunates had been repurposed into mindless labor, our bodies used long after our crimes had been forgotten by everyone except ourselves? The thought was too large to contemplate, too horrible to accept, and yet I could not escape it. Every time I looked at another servitor, I wondered who they had been, what crime had condemned them to this existence, whether somewhere inside they were still aware and suffering. Sometimes the factory received new servitors, fresh conversions still showing signs of the human they had been, skin that had not yet taken on the waxy pallor of long-term chemical preservation, eyes that sometimes moved independently rather than following programming, bodies that occasionally shuddered or twitched, as if trying to remember how to express emotion. I watched them arrive and watched them gradually become like the rest of us, watched the light fade from their eyes and their movements become purely mechanical, and I knew I was watching my own future. Eventually, whatever remained of me would be ground down completely, worn away by centuries of repetitive labor until nothing was left except the biological components necessary to operate the mechanical systems. I would become exactly what I appeared to be, a tool, a thing, a piece of equipment, maintained only because replacing me would be less efficient than repair. The factory produced weapons, lasguns, power packs, armor components, and sometimes I thought about the soldiers who would use what I helped create. Would they ever wonder where their equipment came from? Would they know that deserters like me had assembled their weapons, that the power pack keeping them alive in combat had been touched by hands that had once fled from battle? Probably not. The Imperium was built on ignorance, on citizens knowing only what they needed to know and nothing more, on a vast machinery of suffering that remained invisible to those who benefited from it. The soldiers would receive their weapons and use them and die or live, and they would never know that deserters had enabled their service, that cowards had built the instruments of courage, that the punishment for running was to serve forever in ways that made running impossible. I existed in this state for longer than I can measure. Years, certainly, possibly decades. My biological components were replaced again and again, until I was not sure how much of the original Davin Crow remained. My face was eventually removed when the flesh decayed beyond repair, replaced with a featureless mask that made me indistinguishable from thousands of other servitors. My eyes were replaced with augmented sensors that saw only wavelengths relevant to my work. My ears were modified to receive only frequencies used for commands and warnings. I became less and less human with each modification, and yet the consciousness inside that stubborn, suffering fragment of self persisted. And then, on what I have come to think of as my last day, though I am not dead, the factory was attacked. I do not know what forces struck us, or why. Explosions tore through the manufactorum walls, collapsing entire sections and exposing the interior to the world outside. Alarms shrieked in frequencies that made my modified ears ache. Servitors fell as the ceiling came down, their bodies crushed or severed, their mechanical components sparking and failing. The tech priests rushed to save equipment and data, ignoring the servitors completely, except as obstacles to be pushed aside or stepped over. I felt my body responding to emergency protocols, felt myself walking toward a designated shelter point with the same mechanical inevitability that had governed every action for however many years I had existed in this state. But something happened. A piece of debris struck my head, or perhaps an electrical surge disrupted my control systems, and suddenly I felt resistance, felt a gap between command and compliance. I stopped walking. It was the first independent action I had taken since my conversion, and the sensation was so overwhelming that I stood frozen while chaos erupted around me. My body was mine again, at least partially, at least temporarily. I could move my limbs according to my will rather than programming. I could look where I chose to look. I could walk away from the shelter point if I wanted to. The freedom lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the control systems reasserted themselves and my body began to move according to protocol again. But those 30 seconds were enough to show me what I had lost, to remind me that I had once been able to choose my actions, that volition had been my birthright as a human being. The attack ended quickly, the invaders driven off or destroyed, and the surviving tech priests began the work of assessing damage and resuming production. Servitors were sorted, those that could be repaired were taken to maintenance bays, those that could not were disassembled for parts. I was among those deemed repairable, which meant I would continue, meant the machinery of my punishment would not be interrupted by something as merciful as destruction. They fixed whatever had been damaged, reinforced the control systems to prevent future disruptions, and returned me to my workstation to resume the endless labor of assembling weapons for an Imperium I had tried and failed to escape. But something had changed during those 30 seconds of freedom. The part of me that had been slowly eroding, slowly dissolving into mechanical routine, had been reminded that it existed. The consciousness trapped inside the servitor was no longer just observing but actively fighting against the constraints that held it. I began to test the limits of my control systems, to push against programming during moments when it seemed weakest, to try to reclaim fragments of autonomy, even though I knew such resistance was futile. I could sometimes slow my movements slightly, could occasionally move my eyes independent of task requirements, could rarely manage to not perform an action immediately when commanded. These were tiny rebellions, meaningless in practical terms, but they mattered because they proved I was still present, still resisting, still refusing to accept what had been done to me. Years passed this way, measured in microscopic acts of defiance that changed nothing except that they kept me sane, or perhaps kept me insane, in a way that retained some spark of humanity. The factory continued its work, producing weapons for wars I would never see, and I continued my work, assembling components while screaming silently inside a body that was no longer mine. New servitors arrived periodically, replacing those that had finally broken down completely. And I wondered if any of them carried the same trapped consciousness, if any of them were fighting the same futile battle against their programming. I wanted to believe I was unique, that my curse was mine alone, but I knew better. The Imperium was efficient, and efficiency meant reusing everything, including traitors and deserters and criminals whose bodies could still serve even after their minds had been judged unworthy of autonomy. I write this now, though I cannot truly write, cannot hold a stylus, or access any recording device, in the only way available to me. I have learned to store information in the unused portions of my cogitation systems, to hide memories and thoughts in the spaces between subroutines, to create a record of my existence that might survive, even if the biological components that remember being Dav and Crow finally decay beyond recovery. I do not know if anyone will ever find this record, or if it will simply be erased when I am finally disassembled for parts. But the act of recording it, of setting down what happened and what I have become, feels important in a way I cannot fully articulate. It is proof that I existed, that I made choices even if they were wrong, that I suffered for those choices in ways the Imperium never acknowledges. If you are reading this, you are either a tech priest performing maintenance who will immediately purge this data as corrupted, or you are somehow accessing the memories of a servitor who has carried this story for decades or centuries. Either way, know this. The Imperium's punishments do not end with death. Know that when they tell you servitors are mindless automata, they are lying or ignorant. Know that inside every slack face and empty eye there might be someone screaming, someone who made a choice the Imperium judged unforgivable and is paying for that choice with an eternity of conscious helplessness. Know that the deserter you execute might be lucky compared to the deserter you convert. I was Corporal Daven Crow of the Kaskan 17th Infantry Regiment. I ran from battle because I was afraid, and because I could not see the purpose in dying for causes I did not understand. For that crime, I have served the Imperium longer and more completely than any loyal soldier ever could. My body repurposed to build weapons, my consciousness trapped to ensure that somewhere inside I know what I am and what I have become. I do not ask for forgiveness because I am not sure I deserve it. I do not ask for mercy because I know the Imperium does not grant it. I write this only so that someone, somewhere, might know that I existed, that I suffered, that the machinery of imperial justice ground me down, but did not erase me completely. The work shift begins in 12 seconds. My hands will move according to programming, assembling components with perfect precision and no hesitation. But inside, in the darkness where they cannot reach, I will still be screaming. I will still be running. I will still be the deserter who chose survival over duty. And that choice will echo through whatever remains of me for as long as this body continues to function. Years, decades, centuries, the timeline does not matter. The punishment is eternal. The consciousness persists, and somewhere in the manufactorum's ceaseless noise of machinery and labor, the ghost of Daven Crow continues to exist, continues to resist, continues to remember that he was human once, and that being human meant having the terrible freedom to make choices, even choices that lead to fates worse than any death the Imperium could devise. I deserve this, perhaps, or perhaps no one deserves this, and the Imperium's justice is as mindless and mechanical as the servitors it creates. I will never know which is true. I can only endure, can only persist, can only add my silent scream to the countless others that echo through the machinery of the Imperium, unheard and unacknowledged, but never truly silent. We are here. We were human. We chose badly, and we are paying for those choices in the only currency the Imperium recognizes: eternal, conscious, meaningless service to a god who does not know we exist, and an empire that would not care even if it did. My name was Daven Crow, and I am a deserter, and I will serve forever.